Our reading from the Bible this morning comes from 2 Kings and chapter 5. If you want to follow in the Chapel Bible, it's on page 373. As I think I mentioned last week, there aren't any specific Bible passages allocated to some of these subjects, so I asked Dawn, what were the children thinking of doing? And they said, 2 Kings 5. I said, okay, I'll go with that. We'll have a look at 2 Kings and chapter 5. We're not going to read the whole of the chapter, but we're going to start at verse 1 down to verse 19, or just the beginning of verse 19. Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram, or the king of Syria. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message, "Why have you torn your robes? Make the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you have not done it? How much more then what he tells you? Wash and be cleansed." So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept the thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." "Go in peace," Elisha said. So we trust that God will just bless us as we have a little look at this passage. As Dawn has mentioned before us this morning, the subject is ministering grace and love. So as God has perhaps shown grace and love to us, how can we then show that grace and that love to others? And we've read of an event which happened approximately 3,000 years ago, of this little girl and this miracle-performing prophet, but we're going to have a look and see what these two individuals might teach us about showing grace and love to others. Now, the setting for the story is that you've got this notable military commander of the Syrian army called Naaman, and he is being afflicted with leprosy. And that's the setting. Now, to understand fully a few things that are going to crop up in that passage, we need just to take a moment to think about the relationship between Syria and Israel at that particular time. Syria and Israel were at war with each other on and off for about 200 years. The first time we read about the two nations being at war with each other is actually at the end of Israel's second king, Solomon. Go to 1 Kings chapter 11. You'll find that Solomon generally had been faithful to God through his reign, but at the end, he drifted away into idolatry, led away by the wives that he'd married from different nations and different religions, and they drifted into idolatry. And God disciplined Solomon at the end of his life by raising up 3 enemies against him. One of those enemies was a guy called Rezon, R-E-Z-O-N. I don't know whether that's how you correctly pronounce his name. I've probably well and truly butchered it. But we read about him that he reigned over Syria. And so that is the beginning of this ongoing war that happened on and off between Syria and Israel. What you'll find is, as you read through the history, going through end of 1 Kings 11, right up to about 2 Kings chapter 16, you read about various encounters that Israel and Syria had, various battles, various wars. And God used Syria various times to discipline Israel. There was a particularly evil king at the end of 1 Kings called Ahab. God used a battle with Syria to bring his life to an end. We read here in verse 1 that Naaman was a great commander. It says he was a great man with his master and in his high favor, because by him the Lord had given him victory to Syria. And it could have been that battle that you read of at the end of 1 Kings chapter 1 Kings, where Ahab dies, was the battle that Naaman fought in and the battle that he commanded. You can go on a bit further, 2 Kings chapter 8. There was another evil king by the name of Ahaziah. Again, I've probably butchered that. But God uses Syria to bring that to an end. 2 Kings 10, God's disciplining Israel again for their sin. He says he uses Syria to reduce the size of the nation. So the 2.5 tribes that had their land east of the Jordan, they were taken captured by Syria. 2 Kings 13 tells us that God again uses the Syrians to discipline his people Israel. And they gave many victories to the Syrians through their 2 kings, Hazael and Ben-Hadad. And so we can see that God was using the Syrians, and they had this ongoing war with Israel. They weren't at war all the time, but they were for a major period, that 200-year period of history. God was using Syria to discipline his people, Israel. Now, does that mean the Syrians were good, a good people? No. But sometimes God uses bad people to accomplish his good purposes. And what we find here actually is, as we're just thinking about it, how that God uses the nations to accomplish his purposes. God is orchestrating the nations to accomplish his purposes. And we might be praying for situations that involve the nations. We might be praying for Ukraine. Ukraine's been on my daily prayer list ever since the thing started, but there's still war going on. Middle East, Israel. Perhaps our prayers for these situations are not being answered as we would like. If that's the case, then we have to trust that God is orchestrating the purpose of the nations to bring about his good purposes. And we need to trust God over that, even though we might not like the things that we see and the things that are going on. But there was something else about these Syrians. They weren't known for being gracious and merciful. Our theme this evening is about being gracious. They weren't known for that, particularly when they conquered their enemies. So Hazael was a king of Syria, but before he was king, he was an ambassador. And the current king of Syria sent him to Elisha to ask the prophet, to ask Elisha, will my king recover his health? Elisha said to him, no. In fact, you will end up being the king of Syria. And as Elisha is telling this to this ambassador, Hazael, he starts crying. And the conversation is, well, why are you crying, Elisha? And Elisha says, I'm crying because I know what you will do to my people Israel. And he lists 4 things. He says, number 1, I know you're going to burn our fortresses. You could expect that in war. Number 2, you're going to kill our young men with the sword. You can expect that in war. Number 3, you're going to dash our children to pieces. Now, how do you understand that? How would you dash something to pieces? You drop it from a height. That's how you dash something to pieces. You might think, has the Bible got that right? Number 4, you will rip open our pregnant women. Not a pleasant people, especially if you were a conquered enemy. And that gives us perhaps a little bit of setting to what we're reading. Because what we find that some of Naaman's soldiers, some of his army, they've gone raiding in Israel and they've captured this little girl. Depends what version you read. Some say little, some say young girl. Now, we don't know all the circumstances. Had they raided a village and just stolen her? Her parents were alive? Had they come in, raided their village? Were her parents now dead and she was an orphan? How old was she? Says young girl, little girl, depending on your version. She was serving Naaman's wife, so I assume she was of an age where she could carry out tasks. You know, she wasn't a 2-year-old. Perhaps, I don't know, 8, 10, 12 was she? Something of that nature, possibly. Perhaps a little older. We don't, not 100% clear. But she's been taken off to Syria. Now, she's ended up in this house of this commander serving his wife, and he's got leprosy. What might you think would be her response, possibly? She's been separated from her family. It's no doubt been traumatic. She perhaps doesn't even know if her family is still alive, whether if they are still alive, she's ever going to see them again. There's a sense in which you wouldn't blame her if she said, well, Naaman, you've got leprosy. Great. I'm glad you've got leprosy. You know why? Because that means you've got to keep your distance from your family. You've got to separate yourself from your family, otherwise they'll end. And that serves you right, because you know what? You separated me from my family. But you know, when you read the story as we've read it, you don't find anything of that attitude from her at all. And perhaps she was looking through the situation and she was aware of the Elisha as the prophet, and therefore I assume she was aware of God, and to a degree, in perhaps a simple way, but nevertheless was aware. And she perhaps was looking at the circumstances through the eyes of, well, actually, knowing what the Syrians can be like. This is bad, yes. I don't want to be in this situation. But actually, God, things could be worse. They could be a lot worse. She's ended up in a home of Syrian nobility and celebrity. Lord, I don't want to be here, but it could be a lot worse. And sometimes perhaps we don't demonstrate the grace and love that perhaps we should because we're wrapped up in ourselves and so focused in on ourselves that we're not other focused, that we're not looking outside ourselves. We're wrapped up in our own pity. But she doesn't seem to be. She's looking at the circumstances, possibly, don't know 100%, looking at the circumstances, Lord, thank you. This could have been a lot worse. Some of you know from the prayer chain that my nephew was involved in a motorbike accident last week. We happened to be here at the prayer meeting on the Tuesday evening when it happened. We got home, turned a phone on, and we had a message from my sister saying that he'd been involved in a crash and that he'd been airlifted to the Heath in Cardiff. He lives down in West Wales. You know, when you hear of airlifted to the Heath in Cardiff, that doesn't bode well, does it? They don't just airlift anybody. That's serious. Now, thankfully, and thank you for your prayers for those who've prayed, as it turned out, he'd just broken his leg and fractured his wrist. Now, if you were to ask him, he said, I'd rather not have a broken leg and a fractured wrist, but actually it's a lot better than it could have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot worse. Some of you know, I try to remember, it's probably blotted out of my mind now, but 10, 12 years ago, we were traveling from when we were living in Barry on Christmas Day down to our family for Christmas meal and to be with our family for a couple of days over Christmas. We'd been here in the Christmas Day service, and then we'd been rushing then to get down to West Wales. I can't, for some reason, build up to Christmas had been particularly hectic. We were all shattered. So as we were driving, kids had fallen asleep in the back. Dawn had fallen asleep beside of me. And then, unhelpfully, I fell asleep in the driver's seat. So we're on the M4, just going past the turning for Neath, slammed into the central reservation, and miraculously found ourselves parked on the hard shoulder. All alive, thankfully. Nobody was hurt. As I clocked that everyone was okay, my next step, I looked out the window. I still had my wing mirror. You know what? I thought, God, I still got a wing mirror. That can't be that bad. I tried to open the car door. I couldn't. But, and the car needed plenty of work to sort it out afterwards. But actually, it could have been a lot worse. A lot worse. And in her situation, this little girl was potentially being gracious out of the fact of God's grace to her that the situation could have been a lot worse. It could be that that wasn't the route that she took. It could have been that she simply forgave the Syrians for what they had done to her in taking her from her family and taking her to this situation. As I said, there seems to be no evidence that she got bitter about it, that she was angry about it, or that she blamed God for it. We read that with Joseph, don't we? If we go back into the book of Genesis, he was someone else. He was unjustly sold into slavery and worked for a guy called Potiphar. But while he was there, he endeavored to be the best slave he could be. He was unjustly, a little later on, put in prison. But while he was in prison, he endeavored to be the best prisoner he could be. He hadn't allowed himself to go down that road of anger and bitterness and blaming God. If you look at the story of Job and all the troubles that he went through, you'll notice his wife went down that road. She said, "Why don't you curse God?" She was angry with God over what had happened. And in fact, when you get to the end of Job's story and God starts blessing him, one of the things that's not mentioned is about his wife. But her grace and love was demonstrated perhaps just in simply forgiving. Dawn had that verse on the screen for us, taken from Ephesians, that we're called to forgive one another. And then how else did she show grace and love to the situation? She told her mistress, and her mistress told Naaman about the fact that there was a man in Israel, a prophet, who could heal Naaman. She shared, if you like, that good news with them. It wasn't just that she forgave them for taking her off and bringing her to Syria, away from her family, but she actively stepped forward and said, "Naaman, I know someone who can help you. I know someone who can heal you." And she shared that good news. "I know someone who can cure you from your leprosy." And I suppose that's another way, if it's not stretching the point. We have a good news message. A good news message about a prophet who has the miraculous power to heal us and to cleanse us. That prophet, of course, for us is not Elisha, it's Christ, the ultimate prophet, the one who ultimately represents God the Father and speaks on behalf of God the Father, the one who is able to cleanse us and cure us of the leprosy of our sin, which our hearts are riddled with. The only one who can do it for us, as Dawn was sort of stressing to the children this morning. And we have that message that we can pass on to others. There's a question for us, though. Have you had your sin cleansed? Are you cleansed of your sin? Have you been forgiven of that sin? The hymn says, "Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power?" But this little girl, however old she was, she said, "I've got a message of hope for Naaman. There's a man out there who can cleanse him and heal him." And we have an opportunity to show grace and love by telling people the same. There's a man who can heal your heart. There's a man who can cleanse you of your sin. And that is Jesus Christ. One thing I loved about this little girl was she was totally and absolutely confident in that message. I know a man who can heal Naaman. And for us as Christians here this morning, if we aren't Christian here this morning, that's a challenge to us, isn't it? How confident are we that we know a man who is the answer to people's need? She said, "I know a man who can heal you." Confident, completely in the message that she was given, and may we be confident to do the same. We thought about that little girl. We're going to sing again, and then we're going to come back and just briefly think about the prophet Elisha. So we find then that this little girl, this young girl, she had demonstrated her grace and love towards Naaman and his wife. And so Naaman now is acting on that information, that message of hope that he's been given. And so he has this conversation with the king. They draft this letter that goes off to the king of Israel. As I said, they weren't always at war, these two nations. There were times of peace, and it would seem that this was one of those times. I can't imagine if they were at war that Naaman would be going and asking this. But it was a time of peace, and he had this letter. Looks like it might have gone ahead of him, or he'd taken it with him, presented himself before the king. And the king of Israel seems a bit confused, asking, well, who do you think I am? How can I do a miracle like that? I can't heal you of leprosy. Thought that possibly this was Syria's way of provoking Israel, getting them into a fight and another war. But whilst the king of Israel, and he's torn his clothes over this issue, which was a scenario in those days, if you were distraught and distressed over something and you wanted to demonstrate it, you would tear your clothes. And so here the king has torn his clothes, and Elisha hears about it. And Elisha, this prophet, man of God who's capable of doing these miracles through the way that God had blessed him, he gets in touch with the king and he says to the king, look, send Naaman down to me. I'll deal with it. I'll sort it. And he was proactive, it would seem, in that. He didn't wait for the king to get in touch with him. Elisha said to the king, I've heard you got this issue. I've heard you got this problem. I can deal with it. Send it down to me. Send Naaman down to me. And there's another illustration, I suppose, of how we can demonstrate grace and love. Someone's got an issue. Someone's got a problem. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to sort it. They don't know how to progress it. They don't know how perhaps, that it can be resolved. But someone else does have that knowledge. Someone else does have that gift. Someone else does have that ability. And Elisha recognized, I can help you with that issue. Send it down to me. You're finding this thing a burden. I can take that burden off you. And what does it say in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2? Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And here we see an example of the grace and love shown by Elisha. He says, I can see you've got a problem. I can help you with that problem. Let me take that problem off you. But then when Naaman comes, we find that Elisha then gives him specific instructions on what he needs to do in order to be cleansed of his leprosy. The little girl had said, I know a man who can help you. He's now in front of that man, and the man is now giving those specific instructions. And again, it comes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier. Here we find Elisha giving this man the specific instructions about how his leprosy can be dealt with and how his leprosy can be healed. And we can do the same for people. If we take that illustration that we were talking about earlier, that leprosy perhaps is a picture of our sin, people might know or hear that Christ can be the answer. We've talked about or heard about, this quiet revival. People have an idea that God can be the answer. They're buying Bibles, they're showing an interest, but they still need a bit more direction, a bit more specific. And we know the specifics, don't we? The specifics are, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. Whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. And here we find Elisha comes to Naaman. He says, look, these are the specific instructions. Let me give you some more information. Let me give you more detail. And that was the way in which he demonstrated his grace and love, pointing Naaman to the very specifics of how his issue could be dealt with and resolved. And he did it without demanding any price for it, any return for it. It was done generously. The little girl probably didn't have any bargaining power in terms of, look, I'll give you this bit of information. Well, she might have. I'll give you this information if you set me free. Possibly, I don't know. But she doesn't bargain with it. She might have had that information and held it over Naaman and his wife, but she doesn't. Elisha was in a situation where he said, I could make some money out of this. I know this man. He's brought all this wealth with him. I'll get a bit of that, but he doesn't. His love is demonstrated freely, generously, as he gives these instructions to Naaman. Because you could ask the question, well, why would he bother? He knows he's an adult now. He's not the little girl. He probably has more awareness of the history between Israel and Syria, more awareness of Syria as potential enemy for his own people. And he has in front of him the most capable, successful Syrian commander. You'd be thinking, I don't think I want this guy to be healed, really. If this is his task, this is his job, I don't really want him functioning at his best. If he doesn't have this leprosy, he can be there on the battlefield. If he doesn't have this leprosy, he'll be functioning at his best. He could do the most damage to my people. And yet, he still gives him the instructions. He still shows that love and grace to this man. I think, again, it came up in one of Dawn's verses, possibly, I can't remember, but if not, then what are we exhorted to do? To love our enemies. Love our enemies. And this is what that little girl and Elisha both did. Dawn was telling the children, it's easy if it's people you love and the situation is great. But what about the people who are not so kind to you, or the people who are not so nice, or the people that are antagonistic? Those who don't like you, or have not been particularly good or gracious to you. And yet what we find here is Elisha lived that out. What Christ taught in the New Testament, he was living it out in the Old Testament. Love your enemies. And here we see Elisha doing that. And so then, as we think about the fact that God has been gracious to us and loves us, how then do we show that love and grace to others? And I think this little girl and this prophet teach us various things. They teach us about being forgiving. That's how we can do it. They teach us about being aware of our own circumstances, not getting wrapped up in ourselves, but we can be gracious and loving to God, to others, when we really recognize how God has been gracious and loving in our situations. And we might think about our situations and say, well, they're not the best. But without God, they could be worse. And we found that she had information, a hope that she could give Naaman. And she didn't keep it to herself, but it was generous and given. And then we have Elisha, the one who bore someone else's burden, the one, again, who shared that life-saving information, the one who loved his enemy. All the ways that Christ calls us to show grace and love to others. Just trust that God will bless his word to us. We'll just have our final song, and then I'll close in prayer and our service will be over. Our final song is, I'm not sure, I've got it down twice on my... I Speak Jesus, yes, thank you.